Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me on.
We're delighted to have you on, and let's jump right into it. So, uh, just a couple of weeks ago, the Nobel Prize winners were announced for economics, and most of them either embraced or introduced or developed or participated in the introduction of randomized controlled trials in economics. Um, I'm sure that it struck. I mean, obviously, it struck the Nobel Prize committee as a positive, and I
Mhm.
suspect for many people in the public, they must think, well, look, economics is the one discipline where any given prize Nobel Prize winner can win the prize by contradicting the previous year's Nobel Prize winner, right?
Right.
So finally, we're going to have some clarity. We're going to have some firm answers to economic problems. What's wrong with that? But perhaps before you answer the question of because you've been a little critical of that
Right.
approach, give us a little background on when were the randomized control trials introduced in
Uh,
economic studies.
Sure. Well, as your readers probably know, economics has changed quite a bit since its origin 2 or 3 centuries ago as a kind of a logical, theoretical discipline to being one that is much more empirically oriented, especially, since the latter half of the 20th century when economics became viewed more as kind of a branch of applied mathematics, applied statistics. People have the view that I don't know what, physics is the queen of the sciences and medicine is slightly, biology and medicine are slightly lower on the totem pole. And if a subject like economics or any social science, sociology, political science, is to be truly scientific, quote unquote, it needs to embrace the same methods that are used in the natural sciences. Now, in the social sciences, we typically didn't have the ability to perform laboratory experiments. If the question is what caused the Great Depression, well, you can't run a simulation of the Great Depression in the lab. You can't build a physical model with wires and so forth, although people have tried to do this. Uh, you can't address those kinds of questions using, what people in the sciences or in medicine would call the experimental method or experimental methods.
Mhm.
So, what economists, mainstream economists, have done is, up until recently, is to try to imitate sort of scientific processes as much as possible using other kinds of techniques, primarily secondary data, right? Collecting secondary data on firms and industries and economies and lots of other characteristics, and then subjecting these data to various kinds of statistical analysis, running linear regression or other kinds of regression models on secondary data, and trying to infer something about cause and effect or how different characteristics of the economy are related, again, as kind of a second best alternative to the gold standard of doing actual experiments in the lab. Well, within the last 2 or 3 decades, people have begun to do a little bit more of kind of laboratory work. And partly this coincides with the so-called behavioral economics movement or the rise of behavioral economics, where we want to know if you put consumers in a room and you give them a red shirt and a blue shirt, under what conditions will they choose the red shirt over the blue shirt? And
Mhm.
there's a whole lot of literature on this. Some of your readers have maybe seen or heard of people like Cass Sunstein, who is a legal scholar and former Obama administration regulatory czar. He wrote a couple of books with the Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler
Right.
on using what they call behavioral nudges. If you want people to eat healthy, then you put the salads in the front of the buffet line and you put the mac and cheese at the back of the line where you have to reach farther for it, and then people are more likely to eat healthy. That's the kind of
Sure.
experiments
And
that those guys have done.
did that come about because there was um, all of a sudden people realized that um, man's behavior is a lot more complex than previously
Yeah,
anticipated, or
yeah.
we
So
talk about Homo economicus being sort of a rational, maximizing, profit or
yeah,
utility and that sort of thing.
you can kind of sympathize with the behavioral economists in the sense that they were reacting to mainstream neoclassical models or theories, which do have this highly simplified Homo economicus kind of assumption. Well, human actors are these rational calculating machines, they're maximizing their utility and so forth. The behavioralists came along and said, well, mainstream economics is deficient in its appreciation for psychology. And then we need to incorporate the psychology of real human beings into our, analytical models. I mean, we'll come back in just a minute to how Austrian school economists approach these problems. But to get back to your original question, what the three Nobel laureates have pioneered is the movement to go beyond kind of simulations in the lab to actual field experiments, to doing actual experiments in the field. So the Nobel laureates are famous for doing work in developing countries in India, sub-Saharan Africa, and so forth. You want to know, how do you improve children's educational outcomes in schools? Well, let's go into a school and we'll do what our friends in the medical field do. We'll take a group of children who have a disease, namely they're in an underperforming school, or they're in a school in a poor country that has weak educational institutions. We'll come up with a treatment. So maybe the treatment is we give them free textbooks, or we give them free eyeglasses. We'll randomly split the students into two groups. One group will give the free eyeglasses, and then we'll have a control group that doesn't get any free eyeglasses. And then we let them learn, and we see in a year's time if the ones that got the treatment have better test scores or some kind of measurable outcome than the ones that didn't get the treatment. If so, we'll say we have now successfully demonstrated empirically that giving free eyeglasses to kids will improve their reading scores. That is the experiment. You write that up, you publish it in a journal, and you've now advanced our understanding of how to improve the quality of life in poor countries. I mean, there are a number of things you can say about that kind of experiment. One is, it seems pretty obvious that giving people free stuff, they'll respond in some way to getting the free stuff. It's very different. In medicine, we may not really have a sound kind of a priori theory about why taking this particular pill generates this particular outcome. We have some knowledge of the biochemistry, but we can't use introspection and our own knowledge of these processes at a deep level. Sometimes we just have to try different things and see what works. If you believe that we, like neoclassical economists do, that we don't really understand the fundamentals of human action from an a priori introspective view, then why not? Why not do these experiments in the field? Why do people consume more bacon and less bread? Well, if you don't believe that prices have anything to do with it, let's just run a bunch of trials in the field and see what we can do. We'll do various interventions and try to see which ones make people eat more bacon and eat less bread. So that's the model that has become popular now. That was pioneered by these three Nobel laureates, and that's what they were recognized for.
Right. I'll give one example that's related to healthcare economics, and I think many in the medical audience of the podcast will be familiar with, is how do patients react to having health insurance or not? And whether there's what's called moral hazard or not, and there was a famous experiment that ran maybe 5-10 years ago in Oregon, where it wasn't an experimental study in the sense that it was designed by economists, but it was sort of a fluke of health policy, where half of the Medicaid population in Oregon received the Medicaid benefit because they were more beneficiaries than they had money to give the benefits to. So they had a sort of a lottery allocation of Medicaid benefits to half the population, and then they, the group at MIT sort of followed up on that to see if giving health insurance changes the behavior of patients. Do they consume more health care? Do they become healthier, and so forth? We can come back to that experiment later on, but that's the sort of experiment that you're alluding to.
It is, and Michael, I think even in the example that you've given, you've raised one of the fundamental concerns that some economists have raised about the use of these kind of experiments, is that namely, they can only be applied to a particular set of problems, a particular kind of problems that really are not economic problems in a sense, right? So what the three Nobel laureates, the kinds of things that they have studied are the things that, people in medicine or public health or education policy might study. There really isn't much, if any, economic theory. There isn't any use of conventional economic research methods. I mean, these people have PhDs in economics, but what they're doing does not really require a PhD in economics. You
That's
have to be smart and careful, and you need to be able to observe things and write them down in a lab manual and write them up. But there's been a lot of concern about whether performing these RCTs is the best use of kind of scarce economist talent.
That's interesting because I think this is a crucial point, but many people may not really understand the distinction, because I think what you're saying is that these experiments maybe help policy as opposed to help advance knowledge of economic theory.
That's right.
Right. Okay.
So one of the Nobel laureates, Esther Duflo, gave a speech to the American Economic Association on which she described the economist. She said, economists, there's an old debate about whether economists are more like philosophers, more like scientists. She said economists should be more like plumbers. Why? Well, plumbers don't have any grand theory. Plumbers are not trying to address the business cycle or whatever, but you've got a leak.
Whatever
you
works.
Fix it. Maybe, will this kind of sealant fix the leak? Do we need to adjust the pipes this way or that way? Which repair do we perform? Well, we don't really know, but we get our hands dirty, right? We actually get into the plumbing. We try different things. We perform some different trials, and whatever works, we go with that. We may not know exactly why it works, but this seems to have solved the plumbing problem. So then we go on to another thing. I mean, it kind of models the economist as kind of a technocratic policy advisor. Like the goal of economics is to advise government officials about how to tweak, this aspect of the law, or how to adjust a regulation this way or that way. I mean, look, I have no objection to economists providing analysis of the effects of government policies. That's part of what economists do, but I don't think that's the entirety of what economics is all about. And it seems like the randomized controlled trial approach in economics, this sort of school of thought in economics, really, they only address a very, very narrow subset of kind of small engineering problems.
Sure. And even then, it seems that the knowledge gained from running these experiments is not as firm as we might be led to believe.
Yeah. That's true. Well, in the insiders refer to this as the problem of external validity. So how do I know that the eyeglasses experiment that I performed in this particular village in Zambia applies to another context? Will it work in Chicago? Will it work in will it work in Mumbai? Will it work in another village in the same region in Africa? We're not sort of developing general propositions or general theories and then using them to interpret or explain phenomena that we observe on the ground. Rather, we're doing a very atheoretical kind of trial and error. And it's very hard to know whether are we really generating some cumulative knowledge about, look, the big question, why is sub-Saharan Africa poor? Why are parts of the Indian subcontinent poor? And, Western Europe is wealthy. I mean, frankly, we have lots and lots of good theories and studies and ideas about this. And it's really not a great mystery. Countries, we all started out poor. The countries that became rich are those that established private property and the rule of law and free markets and limited government and so forth. And parts of the world that don't have those things did not become wealthy and are not wealthy today. It's not obvious to me why we need to parachute, Harvard and MIT scholars into these villages to perform these little trials. Even if the trial is successful, to me, that's not going to generate long-term economic growth in those countries.
Sure, especially since the idea behind running trials is the presumption that we really don't know, right? I mean, there's a presumption of being neutral about the outcome.
Exactly.
And so that's Again, I'm sure a lot of people in my audience will struggle with that because they will say, well, maybe we really don't know. I mean, so how can we be sure? How can we, and what level of certainty do we need? And do we get enough certainty by theorizing?
Right.
And so how do you
But
approach that?
it's a fair point. I mean, you know, perfect knowledge is not available to us under any, in any system using any means. But I think, the techniques of analysis and study that we apply to answer particular questions depend on the nature of those questions. Many people in the sciences believe that social science is kind of easy and overly simplistic. In fact, it's almost the reverse. I mean, social science is more difficult because you have more complexity in studying interactions among large numbers of human actors than you have in a laboratory setting where you're trying to see how one compound interacts with another compound. Not that either is easy in sort of in a fundamental sense, but you're dealing with a much higher order of complexity in social systems than in many kind of natural, biological, physical, chemical systems, et cetera. The difference is this: even in medicine, we don't know as much as we think we know, right? I mean, of course, there are a lot of medical treatments for which we don't have good answers, cancer and so forth, heart diseases, et cetera. But even something so straightforward as finding out if this particular medical treatment is effective at alleviating this particular condition, for many cases, even that we don't have a clear answer on. Why? Because there are so many complicating factors. There are all kinds of moderating and mediating conditions.
Sure.
We can't keep everything else constant to study just that interaction. Even in human bodies, there are so many other potentially complicating factors that, medicine is hardly an exact science. Why would, if we're asking, if the government increases the money supply, what effect is that going to have on prices and wages? I mean, my goodness, that's an even greater level of complexity than understanding the impact of some kind of biological compound. So what do? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, I guess we can never know? Well, the kinds of economics, the brand of economics that you and I favor, right, says, no, we do have some kinds of knowledge that we can kind of deduce theoretically. There are some very simple laws of interaction among persons. We can think about the nature of scarcity of resources. We can think about the human desire, people's desire to improve their situation through purposeful behavior. We can spin out the implications of exchange and pricing and so forth, as Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and other great economists have done. And from that, we can deduce some basic principles that relate things like money to prices. We know that other things equal, increases in the quantity of money lead to a rise in the level of prices for reasons that have been spelled out, in many sort of different kinds of arguments. Now, if we want to know why are prices rising in Chicago in 2019 on this particular good or service, well, the general principle isn't enough to answer an applied question of that level of precision. But okay, then what do we do? Well, we do go into the field, so to speak. We get detailed historical data. We immerse ourselves in that community. We interview people and so forth with the goal of applying the basic principle to that specific context. Mises used the German word verstehen, which is usually translated into English as understanding. The historian or the applied economist in Mises' system has to have this very deep familiarity with the data and the context and the particular people involved, but the historian doesn't approach that blind and engage in a purely inductive kind of exercise. No, we have some general principles about supply and demand, about prices and so forth, and we use our verstehen to figure out how to apply those principles to the particular conditions on the ground. By the way, entrepreneurs also use a kind of verstehen or understanding. They're trying to anticipate what human actors will do in the future, and our a priori theorizing doesn't tell us exactly what this or that person will do tomorrow. So the entrepreneur applies economic theory but tries to anticipate future conditions using this kind of deep knowledge or deep intuition. The RCT proponents in economics say, no, 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 that's all nonsense. In economics, it's exactly the same as in medicine, where we don't know anything except what we have learned from a series of these kind of small scale experiments.
Right. Well, if they learned about the history of the RCT in medicine, they might they may be sobered.
Yes, indeed.
A little bit, because there's a sense in which in medicine, as you said, we don't. In a way, so the parallels are not exact, because you mentioned earlier in economics, we can, by introspection, understand a little bit how human beings behave, because we ourselves are human beings.
Right.
So we can have a sense. For example, the question of moral hazard with health insurance that I was mentioning. I mean, it's undeniable. I mean, anybody who's practiced medicine, who has any kind of common sense, will realize that, of course, moral hazard exists. I mean, I know myself, when I don't have health insurance, I'm going to live with my torn meniscus. Right. And so and I know it when I practice, and I mean, it's so obvious that to put that to the test and to wait 60 years, because it's really been, when the concept was introduced by Kenneth Arrow in 1962 in his famous paper, he left it up as something that needs to be tested empirically. Really, right? It's something that we couldn't decide. We need the empiricists, and it took 60 years for the experiment to be run, and even now the experiment hasn't really clarified anything. Right, so they had the Oregon Health Experiment. It came up, but people continue to debate, what the significance of that is. So in economics, there is, you can proceed with introspection. In medicine, it's a little bit harder because we're dealing with molecules and whatnot.
Yep.
Our understanding of biology is still very sort of, it's not completely embryonic. I mean, we clearly have advanced, but there can always be a curveball thrown at us by biology that's, at the same time, we're not, so what happens, so people, the RCT in medicine, it's very interesting. If you look at the history of it, it was introduced back in the 70s and 80s, precisely for the same reason that you mentioned earlier, to guide policy. So the person who introduced the term evidence-based medicine is the guy who really wanted guidelines. He was really distraught by the diversity of practices. He wanted to standardize medical practice, and he wanted guidelines. So the RCTs were promoted partly for that reason, to sort of standardize care for the benefit of policy. What's interesting is that the guys who were introducing randomized and pushing for evidence-based medicine in medicine, or pushing for it, were people who were essentially were suspicious of private actors and private doctors, precisely because they were suspicious of the profit motive and whatnot, and doctors doing what they want and so forth, and so they wanted something a little bit more directed and centrally controlled and that sort of thing. Lo and behold, pharmaceutical companies found that the RCT, they could use it to their advantage, because then they could run these experiments with very focused outcomes and show a little benefit, and even if the benefit was marginal, but they could demonstrate, they could say, look, we ran the RCT and it works. And then compel.
You have to give us the approval.
Exactly, compel approval and compel and command, and take the stage and say, look, our stuff works. You need to give it to everybody, right? Right, and discount, the judgment as to whether the doctor may decide, well, maybe this patient, maybe it's not a good idea, or blah blah blah. No. It has to be given. It will go into the guidelines and be given. So all of a sudden, you have the guys who were pushing evidence-based medicine recognize that they've been, that it's been hijacked. The whole project has been hijacked by the private sector for their own benefits. So now, the phase that we're in right now is the phase of heightened suspicion. It's like, well, okay, you've run the trial, but show me the data, right? I want to see the raw data. Show me your analysis, because your analysis, maybe if I had done the analysis this way, I would have gotten a different result, and so forth. And it ends up that now everything is put under scrutiny,
Mm.
and even the randomized control trial doesn't answer anything. It hasn't calmed any controversies. On the contrary, each time you have a randomized control trial, the controversy is multiplied and heightened and so forth. So
So it's interesting, even among some of the field trials that have been performed by the three Nobel laureates, there has been some criticism on similar grounds. They have not always released the raw data, and when they have released the raw data, there have been some critics who have said that data were misinterpreted or things were
right,
recorded incorrectly. And so, it's funny, some critics of kind of the use of deductive theory and deductive reasoning say, well, the problem with that kind of model is you can never really resolve a dispute. All you can do is fight about it. Milton Friedman had a famous critique of the Austrians along these lines. But in fact, I mean, there's plenty of fighting that goes on among
sure,
people who are using RCTs and all kinds of experimental methods. There's always going to be disagreement about what experiment to perform and what's the right way to perform the experiment. Was the experiment done? Were the data properly collected and analyzed? So it's not as if we can magically resolve all kind of scientific disputes by adopting one particular, fully transparent and objective method. There is no such thing.
that's right. And we had on the podcast a few months ago. You're probably familiar with Brian Nosak, who sort of
Oh, yeah.
spearheads the effort to deal with the replication crisis. And he had a paper last year where they had a data set that they gave to 20 different team of statisticians or 30 different teams of statisticians. And then the teams were allowed to collaborate, right? They were allowed to share notes in how they would analyze the data set to answer a particular question of correlation between X and Y. And despite all this collaboration and whatnot, you had 30 different answers as to whether X was correlated to Y, and or the strength of the correlation or the slope and whatnot. So it's really funny, but that's the way it is. I mean, there seems to be something, quantitation and measurement and and data. I mean, there's something compelling about numbers that is not present when you're talking about verbal propositions, right?
Oh, you're exactly right.
But at the same time, numbers have to be about something. They cannot be numbers floating in the air, right? So there has to be a framework of how we understand those numbers, and so ultimately language and propositions and theory has to dominate, and it cannot operate completely autonomously. It has to be based in reality. So you need the data to.
No, that's very insightful.
Right.
I think that economists, like other people in our society, have been sort of caught up in this romanticization or even this sort of fetish about quantification. To be true scientific knowledge, it must be amenable to those kinds of techniques. And so economists are moving away from the older ways of doing things, the use of more intuitive and interpretive approaches, to this idea, well, we can just plug in the numbers and everyone will agree that this is objectively the right answer. Now, I do want to say, in defense of the Nobel laureates and this kind of the approach that they spearheaded, there is a lot of bad empirical work in economics that does confuse correlation and causation.
Right.
And while it isn't always possible to get a proper kind of causal, to construct a causal model and get a real treatment effect through any kind of experimental method, at least recognizing that we need to be more careful about making kind of causal statements, right? Economists, mainstream economists for years have collected lots of data on different aspects of the economy, have found all kinds of correlations and said, aha, now we know what magic button the government should push to get us more Y, because look, more Y always goes with more
Sure,
X.
Sure.
Okay, but now at least economists are a little bit more sophisticated and saying, okay, yeah, to be able to make a causal argument about X being related to Y, we're going to have to do something other than simply look for patterns in the data. We've got to use some kind of technique, and a randomized controlled trial is one of them, but there are other kind of econometric statistical techniques that are increasingly popular now for people to try to sort of identify a treatment effect instrumental variables, and there are different kinds
Right.
of techniques for splitting up samples and looking at matching techniques and so forth. I think they're a little bit the claims are overly bold. I mean, even these techniques have their drawbacks and their limits, like the ones we've just been talking about
Sure.
interpretation and so forth. But I think it is, in a sense, a good thing that mainstream empirical social scientists are a little bit less naive about assuming causality or asserting causality from some kind of test than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
I understand. At the same time, their idea of causality, which is really the predominant idea of causality in the modern world and in the sciences in particular, it's the one proposed by Hume and his followers. So it's a correlation, and then you have the counterfactual. If you don't have the cause, then you don't have the effect, and that sort of thing, which is not really a very realistic approach to causality. I was wondering, Peter, can you maybe in a few minutes, maybe asking too much, but I'd like the audience to understand a little bit what the Austrian school approach is, generally speaking, because for most people, they're going to think that you're talking about psychology or deducing economic theory on the basis of psychology, which is really not the case. And I want, eventually, I'll put some links on the show notes for where people can learn about the Austrian approach to economic theory, which was really the standard economic approach, for a good part of the 19th and 20th century, and remains quite valid because there are a lot of principles that are even the empiricists continue to use without knowing about it. They continue to use some of these concepts. So it's not about the psychology of human beings, but what is it about? How does it start, and how can it build on?
Sure. Maybe it's best demonstrated with a few simple examples, right?
Yeah.
What Austrian school economists mean when they talk about logical deduction is something along the lines of the following. So we imagine that human beings have goals, have purposes, have plans. So a distinction between action action in the sort of economic sense and movement in the purely physical sense is that action is goal directed. So you want me to appear on your podcast. What do? Well, you've got to call me up, or you've got to send me an email, and we've got to have a conversation. You've got to tell me why it's a good thing, why I should be willing to come on your show and so forth. So you've got to go through some particular steps to bring a podcast like this into existence. It doesn't happen by itself. You've got to have a vision of what you want, some idea of a desired outcome. You've got to be aware of particular means that you can employ, right? We've got the hardware and the software that makes a podcast available. You know of some guests that you might want to get on. You know how to contact the guest. You know what persuasive language to use to convince the guest to appear on your show, and somehow you manage.
My emails were very courteous, yeah.
But look, you've got other things that you could do with your time, and let's say you might want Peter to be your guest, but you've got somebody else you might be considering as well, and you can't simultaneously recruit both to fill the same slot. You've got to make some choices among alternatives, right? If you have less time available to spend on podcasting because you have an increase in the number of patients, or you have some other demands on your personal time or whatever, then you're going to have to be more picky about which guests you invite on the show. So you may face some sort of trade-off. If you find that, well, let's say that you offer your guests a generous honorarium for appearing on your show, which unfortunately you don't, but suppose you did. And if you find that it's more expensive, let's say you offer each guest $100 to be on your show, and you have $1,000 budgeted for the show, you can accommodate 10 guests. Suppose you find that guests are much more demanding. Each guest wants $500 to appear on the show. Well, then you can only accommodate 2 guests. Right, so the number of guests that you can accommodate in a particular period depends on how much it costs you to obtain those guests, how much you have budgeted, and so forth. We could imagine a kind of a budget constraint, and we could even construct a demand curve We could say
Right.
other things equal, the less expensive the speakers, the more speakers you can accommodate in a given period. We could even trace out, your listeners may remember those good old supply and demand curves that they found in school, that they learned in school. You can trace out a demand curve, a hypothetical demand curve uh, for consuming a particular product, like podcast episodes, for example, and understand just by thinking about it logically through a few simple steps that other things equal at a higher price, the quantity of units demanded will be lower. And if you want people to purchase more units of this thing, you've got to lower the price to induce them to purchase more units on the margin. We
Right.
could go through an even longer, more elaborate articulation of
No,
that
no, that's great.
approach.
But you're exactly illustrating the way that the theory can come up with these relationships, which
Yeah,
we call laws, right? The law of diminishing marginal utility and so forth, and the
exactly.
law of demand, the law of supply, and so forth. And you can be quite confident about the laws because you're not predicating the obtaining the laws on a field trip where the conditions might change or
Yeah, that's
whatnot
right.
and so forth, or
So
on the psychological makeup
that's right.
of the person, right? It has nothing to do with what kind of personality they have, whether they prefer bacon or ham or
You're
that
exactly
sort of
right.
thing, right?
In fact, in the case of diminishing marginal utility, the idea that as you consume more units of a particular good, the satisfaction you get from consuming an additional unit goes down. Sometimes that is treated in the textbooks as a matter of psychology.
Right,
I think it's
right.
not quite right. People say, well, I like to eat ice cream, but I've already eaten, 3 bowls of ice cream. The fourth bowl I'm not gonna enjoy it that much. And I'm eventually, when as a doctor, I'm sure you would agree, when I get to the 10th bowl or the 20th bowl, it might actually have a harmful effect on my health, or at least it gives me a stomach ache. That's not really the right way to think about diminishing marginal utility. Here's a better way. The way I teach it in my class, I say, imagine that you have a certain number of units of water, gallons of water. If there were only 1 gallon of water in the world, or if you had only 1 gallon of water that you had access to, how would you, to what end or use would you allocate that water? And students can easily recognize, well, I would drink it because I need to drink water to stay alive. Okay, suppose now I have a second gallon of water. I've already drunk the first gallon. My thirst is now satisfied, but I've got a second gallon available. Is there another use besides drinking to which I could allocate that unit of water? Yeah, maybe, cooking. I want to use it to cook a meal. That's also important to my health. So if I have 2 gallons of water, I'd allocate the first to drinking and the second to cooking. What about a third gallon of water? Okay, well, maybe I'd use that for washing. What about a fourth gallon of water? Well, I'd use that to to feed my pet. In other words, as I have more and more gallons of water, I allocate each additional gallon to an end or a use that is less important on my value scale than the previous one. Or if I were to reduce the amount of water available to me, if there's a water shortage in my neighborhood, well, the first person who's going to get left out is the dog, or I'll stop watering my lawn, or I'll stop taking a bath, but I'm not going to give up drinking and die of thirst, right? I'm going to give up less valuable needs and only gradually work my way up to the more valuable needs as this, scarcity of water becomes
Right.
more acute. So in other words, just by thinking about how human beings behave, the fact that we have different ends or objectives that we can achieve with our scarce means, and we rank them. Some of them are more important to the other than others, and we don't give up the most valuable ones first. We give up the least valuable ones first. We can understand this notion that the more of something I have, the less valuable are the last units I obtain because
Right.
they're being allocated to a less important use. That's a purely logical, deductive way of understanding marginal utility. That's the way that Carl Menger did it in his famous 1871 book, Principles of Economics. It doesn't require us to make assumptions about psychology, about the weather, about the particular technology that's involved. And some people think, oh, but that's just a trivial insight. That is so simple and silly. How could that possibly be useful in understanding the world? Well, it turns out the principle of diminishing marginal utility is extremely important in understanding very complex things about consumer behavior, about resource allocation in a market, about moral hazard, and how people consume, purchase health insurance. Even a few basic principles arrived at in a logical deductive manner can go a very, very long way.
Sure, sure. And unfortunately, they get ignored if it leads to conclusions that are contrary to what the powers that be
Well,
want to
that's
do
true.
with their policies,
You're right.
and so forth. Any hope that so is there a tsunami of empiricism, and are the randomistas in charge of economics, or do you think there's reason
Yeah.
to be hopeful that it'll be tempered by?
Yeah, I think so. There's certainly a wave of enthusiasm for the kind of work that the so-called randomistas are doing. There's also some pushback. I think long term, their work will be regarded as a modest contribution to how we can do certain kinds of empirical studies, these little kind of policy interventions.
Mhm.
Those techniques, it's not that they're worthless. I mean, they do have some value when understood with the proper limits. I don't think they're going to lead to any kind of revolution in how we think about economics. I think economics is pretty robust, and contrary to what economists will tell you, deep down, I think they do appreciate this kind of logical deductive system, and they recognize that trendy kinds of empirical techniques and studies might be fun and interesting to do, but I don't think at the end of the day they're not a substitute for the kind of deep knowledge that the good economists over many, many decades and even centuries have given us.
Great. Peter, you're a great teacher of economics, and I want to let the audience know where they can follow you or read or listen to lectures you've given. Do you want to tell us your, I'll have that on the show notes, but
Sure.
your
I have a lot of my videos are on the Mises Institute website, mises.org, mises.org. My Twitter handle is Peter G. Klein. That's Klein. You can find a link to my website if you go to my Twitter bio. And of course, I'd be delighted for people to follow me and to view my stuff. And I'd appreciate and be happy to talk to any of your listeners or viewers if they want to follow up with an email or a message and engage on this topic or some related topic. I'd be delighted to do that.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks, Michael, for having me.
Take care.